Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Voynich Manuscript. Introduction. In the quiet depths of a rare book's library, under soft, golden light, there lies a small ancient book that has confounded and mesmerized the world for over a century. This mysterious volume is known as the Voynich Manuscript. It is a medieval codex filled with strange, looping handwriting that no one can read, and vivid illustrations of plants and stars that no one can quite recognize. Our journey tonight will be a gentle exploration of this enigmatic book, the Voynich Manuscript, uncovering its history, examining its curious contents, and drifting through the many theories that have been woven around it. In a calm and measured pace, like the turning of its aged pages, we will delve into every corner of the Voynich Manuscript's story. By the end of this comprehensive journey, you may find yourself both enlightened by the facts and enveloped in the meditative wonder that this unsolved mystery inspires. Imagine a medieval scriptorium, flickering candlelight, the faint scent of ink and parchment. Somewhere, sometime in the early 15th century, an unknown author put quill to vellum and created a book that would become one of history's most notorious puzzles. The Voynich Manuscript is not just an old book. It is a riddle wrapped in drawings of otherworldly plants, astronomical diagrams, and tiny naked figures bathing in green pools. Over the centuries, scholars, cryptographers, and dreamers have all tried to unlock its secrets, but to this day, the manuscript's text remains undeciphered, its purpose unresolved, and its origin cloaked in legend. In this episode, we'll traverse time from the manuscript's creation to its current resting place at Yale University. We will hear of an emperor who paid a hefty sum for it, of a Jesuit scholar who tried to understand it, and of a book dealer named Wilfred Voynich who brought it into the public's eye. We'll explore each section of the manuscript's content as if peering through a magnifying glass at its pages. The peculiar plants of the herbal sections, the astronomical charts and zodiac wheels, the strange bathing women, and the pages of recipes marked by stars. Moving forward through history, we'll recount the many attempts to crack its code, from early 20th century professors straining their eyes through microscopes, to modern computer scientists applying artificial intelligence. We will discuss every major theory that has been proposed, plausible and fanciful alike. Is it a coded message in an extinct language? An elaborate medieval hoax? A heretical medical manual? A book of magic? Or even something as far-fetched as an alien travelogue? All these ideas have been suggested, and each carries its own backstory and reasoning, which we will gently unpack. We'll paint the backdrop of Renaissance Europe, explain the basics of historical ciphers, introduce colorful characters like Roger Bacon, John Dee, and Athanasius Kircher, and consider how the manuscript reflects the timeless human fascination with mysteries. You can let the details wash over you like a gentle tide, so fluff your pillows, settle in, and prepare to journey into the heart of the world's most mysterious book. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the story of this perplexing manuscript carry you away. Our first chapter begins not at the manuscript's mysterious medieval birth, but in the moment it was rediscovered, and the modern world first learned of its existence, a discovery that would ignite all the intrigue to follow. Chapter 1: Discovery of a Mystery. The modern tale of the Voynich Manuscript begins in the year 1912 in the serene hills of Italy at a Jesuit college near Rome. There, a Polish-American rare book dealer named Wilfred M. Voynich was browsing through a cache of old books for sale. One volume immediately caught his eye. It was not gilded or lavishly decorated like some other medieval manuscripts, but it was intriguingly written in an unreadable script. Voynich could tell at a glance that the manuscript was very old, centuries old, and written entirely in a cipher or unknown language. Its pages, about 9 inches tall and 6 inches wide, were filled with line after line of peculiar writing, accompanied by illustrations of plants, astronomical charts, and human figures. Voynich knew he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. He purchased this mysterious manuscript, along with others, from the Jesuit order, which was apparently selling some holdings to raise funds. Voynich later claimed that when he acquired the book, he found tucked inside it a letter, a century-old letter that offered a tantalizing clue about the manuscript's past. This letter was dated 1665 or 1666. The writing was a bit unclear on the year, and was written in Latin by a man named Johannes Marcus Marci of Prague. Addressed to the scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome, the letter essentially said, "I'm sending you this mysterious manuscript, which has defeated all attempts at decipherment. It once belonged to Emperor Rudolf II, who paid 600 gold ducats for it, believing it was the work of Roger Bacon. We aren't sure of that authorship, but perhaps you, Kircher, famed solver of riddles, can unlock its secrets." Imagine Voynich's excitement as he pieced together this context. Emperor Rudolf II was a Holy Roman emperor known for his interest in alchemy and the occult. Roger Bacon was a legendary 13th century English scholar, often associated with mystical and scientific secrets. And Athanasius Kircher, the addressee of the letter, was a 17th century Jesuit polymath, famous for, among many things, claiming he could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. The presence of Marci's letter indicated that the manuscript had been an unsolved enigma even in the 1600s, and that it had passed through the hands of emperors and scholars. Voynich realized he had a genuine historical mystery in his possession. Wilfrid Voynich was not a man to keep such a sensational find quiet. He brought the manuscript back to London, where he had an antiquarian book business, and began showing select pages to experts, trying to generate interest in deciphering it. In 1921, he even exhibited some pages in New York and gave interviews to newspapers, stirring public curiosity. He boldly proclaimed that when the manuscript's secret was revealed, it would startle the scientific world. Voynich was convinced, or at least he publicly claimed, that the manuscript contained groundbreaking knowledge, perhaps the black magic of the Middle Ages, or scientific discoveries far ahead of their time. One can picture Dr. Voynich, as he was sometimes called, standing in front of an audience with these yellowed pages of unknown writing, as people peered in with fascination and puzzlement. For Voynich, the hypothesis was clear. He believed this was Roger Bacon's lost book, written in cipher. Bacon, a friar and scholar of the 1200s, had a reputation in lore as something of a wizard or proto-scientist, credited, probably erroneously, with inventions in advanced knowledge. If Bacon had written a secret book of wisdom in code, that would indeed be sensational. Voynich's theory also neatly connected the dots from Marcy's letter. Emperor Rudolf II, in the late 1500s or early 1600s, thought it was Bacon's work, which might explain why he paid a fortune for it. However, Voynich's Bacon theory, enticing as it was, lacked proof. Voynich himself could not read a single word of the manuscript, nor could any of the scholars he enlisted early on. The script was wholly unfamiliar. Not Arabic, not Hebrew, not Greek, not any known alphabet. Likewise, the plants drawn in the book didn't exactly match any known species, and the astronomical diagrams, while recognizable as suns, moons, and stars, featured odd details. For instance, zodiac symbols were present, but sometimes in an unusual order. The more one looked at the Voynich manuscript, the stranger it seemed. Wilfrid Voynich guarded the manuscript closely and spent the rest of his life trying to solve it, albeit unsuccessfully. He wrote reports and corresponded with experts about it. By the time of his death in 1930, the manuscript had not given up its secrets, and it was still known simply as the Roger Bacon cipher manuscript, owing to Voynich's conviction of its authorship. Eventually, the book passed to Voynich's widow, Ethel Voynich, herself a remarkable person, an Irish-born novelist and daughter of mathematician George Boole. After Ethel's death, the manuscript went to her friend and secretary, Anne Nill, and then was sold to another book dealer, Hans P. Krause, who likewise found it unsellable as an unsolved treasure and eventually donated it to Yale University in 1969. That's how it came to reside in Yale's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it remains cataloged as MS 408. As we conclude this chapter of discovery, imagine the manuscript's arrival at Yale, delivered into the hushed sanctuary of a rare book vault. Scholars could now access it more readily, and its digital images would later be put online for the world to see. Yet, back in 1912 to 1920, none of those pages were available. All anyone were able to see were cryptic pages and an old letter hinting at Roger Bacon and Emperor Rudolf. The scene is set, a mysterious book without a key, and a wide-eyed book dealer proclaiming its importance. The modern world's fascination with Voynich Manuscript had begun, and countless questions hung in the air. Before we chase those questions further, let us gently turn the page to explore the artifact itself. What exactly does this manuscript look like? What is inside it? To truly appreciate all the theories and efforts that will come later, we must first stroll through the Voynich manuscript's contents, a virtual tour of its sections and illustrations, as if browsing through a very strange and beautiful picture book. Chapter 2: Physical Description and Contents. Let's imagine carefully untying the faded binding and opening the Voynich manuscript. The first sensation is its size. It feels like a small tome, roughly the dimension of a paperback novel. The material of the pages is not paper, but vellum, sheets made from calfskin, common for medieval manuscripts. The vellum has a smooth but tough texture, and here and there you might spot imperfections, a hole, or a thin spot, reminders that these pages were once the hide of an animal. Modern testing, like carbon dating, has confirmed that the parchment is genuinely old, made around the early 1400s. In fact, tiny samples of the vellum were tested and dated to approximately 1404 to 1438. So whatever the Voynich manuscript is, it is not a modern forgery on recent paper. It's a creation of the late medieval period. The ink and paint on its pages have also been examined and found to be consistent with those historical times. In other words, this book is authentically medieval in its material. Now, as we turn pages softly, what do we see? Almost every page is filled with flowing text in an unknown script. The script, often called Voynichese, is made up of strange characters. Some characters resemble Latin letters or numbers. One looks a bit like a fancy 4, another like a 9 or a 2. Some look like stylized letters C or E, and others are unique forms. They are written left to right in rows, like a normal Western text, and there are clear spaces separating what appear to be words. But none of these words correspond to any known language. It's as if someone invented their own alphabet, and maybe their own language to go with it. There are no obvious punctuation marks, though some stars or peculiar symbols appear in certain sections. Crucially, the Voynich manuscript is not just text. It is lavishly illustrated, albeit in a somewhat naive or crude style. The illustrations are done in ink outlines with washes of color: green, brown, yellow, blue, red. The colors have faded over the centuries, but they're still visible. These drawings provide clues to the manuscript's structure. Scholars have identified that the manuscript seems to be organized into several thematic sections or chapters based on the subject of the drawings. Let us gently guide ourselves through each of these sections. 1. Herbal Botanical Section. Nearly half the manuscript's pages are taken up by drawings of plants. Each page typically shows a large plant drawing, sometimes with a few paragraphs of text around it or below it. Some plants look almost realistic. You might think for a moment you're seeing a weird version of a sunflower or a lily, but none of them exactly match any known species. Leaves, roots, and blossoms are drawn in detail, yet often they have fantastical or composite qualities, as if the illustrator was drawing from imagination or blending features of different plants. Accompanying each plant image is text, presumably describing the plant's properties or uses. This is reminiscent of herbal manuals, or herbals from medieval times, which were like pharmacological guides to plants and their medicinal uses. But here, since we can't read the text, the plants remain anonymous phytomorphs. Have tried to identify these plants, leading to debates. For instance, one drawing looks a bit like a sunflower, which was a New World plant not known in Europe until after 1492, raising questions if it truly is a sunflower or just coincidentally similar. But in general, the herbal section feels familiar in concept, like a botanical guide, yet alien in content. 2. Astronomical and cosmological section. As we turn from the plants, we find pages filled with circular diagrams. These include drawings of suns and moons and stars. There are what look like astronomical charts, perhaps star maps or diagrams of the cosmos. One page shows a large sun with rays. Another shows something like concentric circles with stars and possibly zodiac symbols around the edges. Indeed, there is a subset often called the zodiac section. In that part, you see the 12 zodiac symbols, Aries the ram, Taurus the bull, etc., illustrated in circular diagrams. Curiously, the zodiac charts in the Voynich Manuscript are not exactly in the standard order or have some unusual additions. Some signs appear missing or out of sequence, and each is accompanied by figures, often small nude figures, some holding stars or wearing stars like crowns. Around these zodiac wheels, one finds small bits of text and sometimes the names of the months written in faint, possibly later handwritings in what seem to be Middle High German or a similar language. For example, März for March. These month labels might have been added by someone who owned the manuscript later, trying to interpret it. The astronomical section suggests that whoever made the Voynich manuscript had an interest in the stars and perhaps astrology, linking celestial bodies to whatever knowledge is being conveyed. 3. Biological or balneological section. Now we arrive at one of the strangest set of images. These pages have drawings that appear to depict human figures, mostly women, immersed in fluids. Specifically, there are several illustrations of naked women bathing in pools or tubs, some of which are connected by intricate pipe-like structures or channels flowing with a green or blue liquid. In some drawings, the women seem to be in something like a plumbing system of strange tubes, perhaps representing veins or vessels or some alchemic apparatus. Because some drawings vaguely resemble anatomical parts, like one looks like a womb or internal organ, and because the women are bathing, which in medieval Renaissance context could be medicinal baths or spa cures, this section is often called balneological from the term balneology, meaning the science of therapeutic bathing. Another name for it is the biological section because some think it might represent biological processes or anatomy. However, these interpretations are speculative. What we concretely see are robed or nude female figures, stars or flowers, sometimes held in their hands or hair, and water flowing through odd, architecturally drawn channels. It's both whimsical and baffling, like scenes from a dream. Perhaps it's an allegory for life, or perhaps a secret ritual, or something medicinal. We simply don't know, but it is memorable. Many people who first see Voynich Manuscript images are struck by these ladies in the baths. 4. Cosmological foldouts. Among the Voynich pages, there are some that fold out to create larger maps or diagrams. One famous foldout page shows a kind of cosmic diagram often called the Rosette page. It has a series of 9 circular mandala-like diagrams connected by pathways, with intricate patterns of stars, castles or cities drawn in miniature, and perhaps a map-like layout. It's as if someone drew a map of heaven or a map of some fantastical land with 9 regions. This foldout is highly detailed and yet inscrutable. Some see in it a map of a volcano or a diagram of a philosophical journey. Others see a pure fantasy landscape. The term cosmological implies it might depict a cosmology or worldview of the universe. These foldouts demonstrate that the manuscript wasn't just random pages, but a planned compendium where even large complex ideas were sketched out. The foldouts are delicate, requiring careful unfolding of the aged vellum. One can imagine a medieval reader puzzling over these large diagrams by candlelight, folding and refolding them thoughtfully. 5. Pharmaceutical section. Next, we find pages that contain multiple small drawings of individual parts of plants, like isolated leaves, roots, flowers, arrayed around the page, sometimes with objects that look like apothecary jars or containers drawn alongside. These pages have a more fragmentary feel, as if they are notes or reference pages. It's called the pharmaceutical section because those jars suggest the storaged herbs in medieval apothecaries, and the snippets of plants could be ingredients. Each plant part might have a short label or paragraph, possibly describing its use in concoctions. The jars are drawn as simple, stylized vessels, some resembling medieval alchemical flasks or potion bottles. This section bridges the herbal with the practical recipe part that follows, reinforcing the idea that this manuscript might be related to medicine or alchemy, fields which often overlapped in those days. 6. Recipes, Stars section. Finally, at the end of the manuscript, we see pages of text arranged as short paragraphs, each marked by a star or asterisk-like flower symbol at the beginning. There are about 300 of these paragraphed lines, each preceded by a star. so sometimes it's nicknamed the star section. We call them recipes, though we don't know if they are recipes in the cooking sense, or medicinal recipes, or spells, or something else. The format, many brief entries, is reminiscent of recipe lists, or maybe an index of key points. If this were a pharmaceutical or medical manual, perhaps these are prescriptions or formulas for remedies, each denoted by a bullet point. None of the text can be understood, but one imagines that each paragraph might say something like, "For fever, mix powder of X with herb Y and give to patient," that kind of thing. Purely an imaginative guess, of course. It could equally be astrological predictions, or any kind of list. The consistent presence of a star-like marker is the only hint of structure. So, in summary, the content sections break down into herbal, astronomical or astrological, biological or balneological, cosmological diagrams, pharmaceutical, and recipes. There is some debate on how to count them. Some combine the cosmological with astronomical, some separate zodiac, but roughly 5 or 6 distinct thematic groupings are present. Notably, this mix of topics, botany, astrology, medicine, and possibly alchemy, is very much in line with the kind of knowledge that medieval scholars or alchemists might compile. It resembles a compendium of natural philosophy or occult knowledge. Many medieval manuscripts were compendia that included herbals, astral charts, and medical advice all in one volume. In that sense, the Voynich Manuscript could be seen as a typical knowledge book of its era, except for the peculiar fact that it's written in a script in language that none of the others used. One important observation to loll over: the script and language used is consistent throughout the book, which suggests a single underlying system or authorial group created the whole thing. The illustrations, while not of high artistic caliber, do follow a unified style. The colors were likely added after the initial drawings, possibly by the same author or an assistant. Interestingly, expert analysis found that the ink appears to be applied directly without evidence of corrections, as if the scribe wrote fluently in this cipher, not hesitating to look up or alter mistakes. This either means the person truly knew what they were writing, or they were very skilled at consistently producing meaningless text that looks structured. Even the page order and missing pages add a layer of mystery. Some pages are clearly missing, perhaps cut out long ago, and the order of pages might have been scrambled by later bookbinders, so we may not even be reading the sections in their intended sequence today. As you picture flipping through this book's pages in a dim, cozy reading room, you might feel a sense of whimsical curiosity. The plants are like something from a fairy tale, the bathing women like a snippet of myth, in the indecipherable script like a wizard's secret code. Many people report that looking at Voynich manuscript pages, even without understanding them, has a strangely soothing yet captivating effect, perhaps because our brain tries to find patterns and meaning, but since it cannot, we are left to simply admire the enigma. bit like gazing at stars whose patterns we cannot fully grasp. We have now acquainted ourselves with what's inside the Voynich Manuscript. With that foundation, we are ready to journey through its history, tracking how this manuscript moved through time from the medieval scriptorium where it was born to modern library where it sleeps today. This historical detective work will introduce key characters such as alchemists, emperors, and scholars who intersected with our book's story. It will also deepen the context for many theories to come. So let us now drift back to the 15th, 16th, and 17th century to follow the manuscript's elusive trail through the ages. Chapter 3: Early History and Ownership. The early life of the Voynich Manuscript is shrouded in mystery. Unlike many medieval books, it doesn't have clear marks of ownership, like an explicit author's name, a colophon, those handy notes scribes sometimes left about when, where a manuscript was finished, or even a formal title. We must rely on secondary clues and later testimonies to reconstruct its journey. The manuscript's origin is generally placed in the first half of the 15th century, 1400s, given the carbon dating of the parchment. Some experts, noting the style of the illustrations and certain costumes or hairstyles drawn, have speculated it might have been created in Italy during the Renaissance. Indeed, the general artistic vibe of the drawings, for example, the style of the castles or clothing on some figures, has an Italian Renaissance flavor. But this is not definitive. Other scholars have considered places like Central Europe as possible origins. There is no known historical reference to the manuscript from the 1400s or 1500s that we can definitively tie to it. So, the 15th and 16th centuries are a blank canvas where we can only imagine who might have authored or compiled this book. The first time the Voynich manuscript clearly pops up in recorded history is in the 17th century. The earliest confirmed owner, as far as records go, was a man named George Barish, also written as Georgius Bartius in Latin. Barish was an obscure figure, an alchemist in Prague, who lived in the early 1600s. We know about his connection to the manuscript from a letter he wrote. In 1639, Barish sent a letter to the renowned scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. In this letter, which was only rediscovered in modern times in 1999 from the archives of the Society of Jesus, Barish described having in his possession a mysterious book in unknown characters peppered with illustrations of plants, stars, and chemical secrets. Barish admitted that he could make no sense of it, despite years of trying. He called it a sphinx that had been uselessly taking up space in his library, because its secrets were locked away by the unknown script. Barish's tone was one of frustration, but also intrigue. He decided to reach out to Athanasius Kircher, because Kircher was something of a celebrity intellectual, known for tackling puzzles. Kircher had recently, in the 1630s, published a book claiming to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs, though his interpretation was later found to be fanciful. Barish perhaps thought Kircher, as a linguist and cryptographer of sorts, might be able to solve this Egyptian sphinx of a manuscript. Interestingly, Barish did not initially send the actual manuscript to Kircher, perhaps fearing to part with it, but he did send copies of some portion of it, maybe a few pages of the mysterious script along with his letter. Imagine Barish painstakingly copying those bizarre characters by hand onto new sheets to enclose with his letter, hoping Kircher might recognize them. Kircher, from what we gather, was intrigued enough, but didn't solve it, or perhaps responded asking for more. Barish apparently corresponded at least twice with Kircher. After George Barish died, around the early 1640s, the manuscript found its way into the hands of his friend Johannes Marcus Marci, the same Marci who wrote the cover letter found by Voynich. Marci was a learned man, a doctor and scientist, and even rector of Prague's Charles University. Marci must have inherited Barish's paper or books, including the mysterious manuscript. By 1665, Marci decided to finally send the book itself to Athanasius Kircher in Rome, fulfilling Barish's original intent. Marci wrote the Latin cover letter we mentioned earlier, summarizing what he knew of the manuscript's backstory for Kircher's benefit. In Marci's letter to Kircher, he relays a fascinating tidbit. Marci says his late friend, a mutual friend of his and Kircher's, Raphael Mishovsky, had told him that Emperor Rudolf II once bought a strange book for 600 ducats and suspected it was authored by Roger Bacon. Marci was careful to note that this was hearsay. Mishovsky had died decades earlier in 1644, so Marci couldn't verify it further. Mishovsky, incidentally, was a cartographer himself and a Bohemian lawyer. He claimed to have invented an unbreakable cipher and had an interest in such mysteries. We will return to him later in theories. For now, consider what that story means. If true, it suggests that the Voynich manuscript might have been in the court of Rudolf II in Prague at the turn of the 17th century. Rudolf II reigned 1576 to 1611, was famous for patronizing alchemists, astronomers. Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler worked at his court, and collectors of oddities. He was fascinated by esoteric knowledge. The story goes that an Englishman, possibly John Dee or Edward Kelly, two English occultists who indeed were in Prague in the 1580s, sold Rudolf this mysterious book, claiming it was by Roger Bacon, the medieval sage. Rudolf shelled out 600 ducats, an enormous sum equivalent to tens of thousands of modern dollars in gold, which shows how valuable he thought it was. If that transaction took place, the manuscript became part of Rudolf's legendary cabinet of curiosities. After Rudolf's death, his collection scattered, and apparently the book ended up with Barish by the early 1600s. However, let's approach that Rudolf Bacon story cautiously. It is a piece of gossip written secondhand in Marci's letter. Marci himself said he was suspending judgment on whether the Bacon authorship claim was true. Nonetheless, Voynich and others later seized on this story because it linked the manuscript to big names. So by 1665, 2+hr in Rome received the manuscript in Marcy's letter. Athanasius 2+hr was a Jesuit priest and polymath who ran a famous museum and library in Rome. He was known for solving riddles, or at least attempting to, and he and Marcy were longtime correspondents. When 2+hr got this mystery book, we don't have a direct record of what he did with it. There is no known publication or solution from 2+hr about the manuscript. Perhaps he tried and failed to decode it. Perhaps it just entered the Jesuit library's collection at the Collegio Romano, the Jesuit college in Rome where 2+hr taught. We do have a curious anecdote. A contemporary of 2+hr's, Andreas Müller, once sent 2+hr some made-up gibberish text, claiming it was from Egypt to test 2+hr, and 2+hr apparently solved it with a translation that Müller knew was bogus, revealing that 2+hr could be overconfident in his translating prowess. This little story, which surfaced later, hints that mysterious texts were almost a fad even back then, and 2+hr's eagerness to be a decoder could have been sometimes misguided. It's been speculated that maybe the Voynich Manuscript was another such intellectual prank. Perhaps Mishovsky or someone created it to fool an emperor or to challenge 2+hr. We'll revisit that idea later, but it's interesting that Marcy's letter has a line that he's sending it to 2+hr to be solved if possible, but he himself won't judge it. One wonders if Marcy or Mishovsky harbored suspicions that the whole thing might be a hoax to perplex 2+hr or others. After 2+hr's time, the manuscript essentially went dark in the historical records for about 250 years. It likely sat in the library of the Collegio Romano in Rome, perhaps catalogued under cipher manuscript or similar. During the turbulent 19th century, many church properties in Italy were confiscated or dispersed. By 1912, the Jesuit or the Italian government acting through them were quietly selling some items, and that's where Wilfrid Voynich entered the scene and acquired our manuscript from that Jesuit collection. There is one intriguing footnote in the chain of ownership. Wilfrid Voynich, after acquiring the manuscript, noticed faint writing on the first page, a signature that read Jacobi a Tepanek. Voynich recognized this name. Jacobus de Tepanek was the imperial chemist and pharmacist at Rudolf II's court, and in 1607 he was ennobled with the name de Tepanek. He was known to have had a large library. Voynich took this as a confirmation that the manuscript had been in Rudolph's court, because Jacob Tepanek's name on it implied he owned it. Perhaps Rudolph gave it to him, or after Rudolph's death, the library was divided. However, modern researchers found that the signature, which had since faded almost invisibly, did not match other samples of Tepanek's signature exactly. There's even the suspicion that Voynich might have forged the faint signature to bolster the Bacon-Rudolph story, though that is a controversial accusation. It's a reminder of how murky provenance can get when big stakes, like proving it was once valued by an emperor, are involved. This brings us full circle to the modern custody of the manuscript that we discussed in Chapter 1. For a moment, let's envision one of those owners, Emperor Rudolf II in his palace in Prague around 1600. He's sometimes depicted as a melancholic, intense figure, surrounded by strange artifacts, automata, exotic animals, alchemical laboratories. He reputedly had a pet lion and was a patron of astrologers. One could picture Rudolf holding the Voynich Manuscript, leafing through its peculiar pages by lamplight, asking his court scholars what they make of it. Perhaps John Dee, the English mathematician and sorcerer, and his medium Edward Kelly presented it to him along with a fanciful story of how it contained the secret of the philosopher's stone or some lost ancient wisdom. Did Rudolf try to decipher it? Did he assign it to his librarians? We don't know, but it's a romantic scenario to imagine. As our chapter on history winds down, we have arrived at a picture of a mysterious book that seems to always attract curious minds and yet slip away unsolved. Barish was confounded, Marcy forwarded in hope, Kusher apparently stumped, and then it vanishes into an archive. It reemerges with Voynich, causing a stir, but again defying decipherment. It's almost as if the Voynich manuscript carries a little curse of indecipherability, intriguing enough to hook people, but yielding just enough frustration to leave them mystified. This pattern will repeat with many who tackle it. Now that we have the timeline of ownership and movement, let's turn our focus to the efforts to decipher the manuscript in the modern era. After Voynich's publicity, the manuscript drew in a host of professional and amateur codebreakers, linguists, and thinkers. In the next chapters, we will traverse the 20th century and beyond, seeing how each generation tried to solve the unsolvable. Keep in mind the historical backdrop we just covered, as many theories about who wrote it and why tie directly into that early history. But first, the puzzle of the text itself called for code-breaking skills that would evolve with time. Let's gently proceed to the early attempts at cracking the Voynich code. Chapter 4. The Modern Quest begins. It is now the early 20th century. The Voynich manuscript, safely in Wilfrid Voynich's hands, has begun to circulate among a small circle of academics. These scholars and cryptographers are enticed by Voynich's descriptions and the few photostatic copies of pages he provided. Imagine them receiving these strange pages in the mail, unfolding them on their desk under lamplight, and feeling both excitement and bewilderment at the task ahead. One of the first serious modern researchers to take a stab at the Voynich manuscript was William Romain Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Around 1919 to 1921, Newbold studied the manuscript closely via copies that Voynich had given him, as Voynich was very cautious about lending out the actual book. Newbold became convinced that the text encodes deep secrets of science, and he formulated a complex, and as it turns out flawed, decipherment theory. Prepare for a tangent into what might be considered an early case of Voynich fever. Newbolt's theory was that Roger Bacon truly was the author, and that Bacon had written the book in a super advanced cipher involving microscopic shorthand. Yes, microscopic. Newbolt claimed that by using a microscope to examine the Voynich characters, he detected tiny extra markings or squiggles on each letter. These, he believed, were Greek shorthand abbreviations, essentially a second layer of coding built onto the letters. If one interpreted those tiny squiggles, one would find a hidden message in Latin anagrammed through Greek abbreviations. Just hearing this, one might realize it's an extraordinarily convoluted proposal. Newbolt worked for years on this, and even announced that he had solved a part of the manuscript. He asserted it contained Bacon's revelations of inventions like the telescope or microscope centuries before they were officially invented. One famous claim by Newbolt was that the Voynich Manuscript talked about using lenses to see stars not visible to the naked eye, implying Bacon had built a telescope in the 13th century. However, after Newbolt's death, other scholars examined his method and found it wanting. The supposed microscopic letters were likely artifacts of the textured ink in parchment. Essentially, Newbolt was probably seeing what he wanted to see. Furthermore, when others tried to use his system, it produced gibberish rather than clear Latin. In 1921, Newbolt presented his solution at a conference, but by 1928, a critique published by John Manley, a cryptographic expert, systematically debunked it, showing that Newbolt's decipherment required leaps of imagination and rearranging letters at will. This was a humbling lesson. The Voynich Manuscript had tempted someone into an elaborate intellectual construct that ultimately collapsed. It highlighted how easy it is to fool oneself when dealing with an unknown script, a theme we'll see again with other would-be solvers. Newbolt's failure did not discourage others. If anything, it stoked more interest. All through the 1920s and the 1930s, various individuals tried out theories. Some thought perhaps it was a straightforward cipher, like each Voynich letter stands for a real letter in some language. A few identified what they thought were actual words or proper names. For instance, certain recurring Voynich words looked a bit like they might be star names or plant names, like one word appearing near a star diagram looked like it could be Taurus. These were tantalizing but unconfirmed identifications. By the 1940s, the manuscript drew the attention of some truly top-notch codebreakers. During World War II, many brilliant cryptanalysts were employed to crack enemy codes. After the war, some of these experts turned to famous historical ciphers as puzzles. The American cryptologist William F. Friedman, who led the team that broke Japan's purple cipher, and his wife Elizabeth Smith Friedman, herself a legendary codebreaker, both had a keen interest in the Voynich manuscript. Starting in the 1940s, they gathered all available data on it. William Friedman even formed an informal study group of cryptologists, including some from the U.S. Signal Intelligence Service, the precursor to NSA, to collectively work on the manuscript script. This team, over years, tried various approaches: frequency counts of characters, looking for patterns, trying to detect if anagrams or substitution ciphers were used. They gave names to certain recurring letter combinations. One big discovery from that era, by a cryptographer named Prescott Currier in the 1970s, building on earlier work, was that the text wasn't uniform throughout. It seemed to fall into at least two distinct dialects, or statistical groupings, dubbed Courier A and Courier B. Certain sections, mostly the earlier herbal pages, used one set of patterns and spellings, A, whereas later sections, like the balneological and recipes, used a slightly different set, B. This could imply two different scribes or two time periods of composition, or perhaps two different underlying languages being encoded with the same script. The lines between A and B are not sharp, but noticeably enough. Additionally, Currier noticed evidence of more than one handwriting style, suggesting multiple scribes copied it. This aligns with the physical analysis that suggested between 2 to 5 different scribes contributed, from subtle differences in how letters are formed. Despite such insights, Friedman and his colleagues never cracked the code. After some decades of effort, William Friedman reportedly came to a personal conclusion. He suggested that maybe the Voynich Manuscript was not a cipher hiding a known language at all, but an attempt at an artificial language, essentially constructed language, or an invented system, possibly made to seem like a cipher. In the 1950s, Friedman wrote that perhaps the manuscript represented, quote, an early attempt to construct an artificial or universal language, unquote. This was an interesting theory. Around the 17th century, a bit after our manuscript's creation time, there indeed was a movement of scholars inventing universal languages or philosophical languages. Could the Voynich Manuscript be such a thing, created ahead of its time? The Friedmans never proved this. It was more an educated hunch after exhaustions of other avenues. Meanwhile, in Europe, others like Dr. René Zandbergen, Jacques Guy, and earlier Joseph Feely, 1940s, and Lionel C. Strong, 1940s, each try their hand with various cipher schemes without lasting success. Feely thought it was shorthand Latin. Strong thought it was a complex cipher yielding in Elizabethan English plaintext. He produced some alleged deciphered fragments, but they were not convincing to others. There was also John Tillman of the UK, a famous cryptanalyst who spent time on it and eventually passed his notes to another researcher, concluding it didn't match any known cipher format he'd seen. Let's slow down for a moment and consider what makes the Voynich Manuscript's text so hard to solve, even for the best cryptographers. The alphabet of the Voynich script has about 20 to 30 distinct symbols, depending on how one interprets certain variations. This is roughly comparable to a normal alphabet in size. However, the distribution of these symbols in the text is unusual. Some symbols appear very frequently, some rarely, but a simple substitution cipher, where each Voynich character stands for a letter of English or Latin, for example, usually ends up with a frequency distribution that matches some known language, like E, T, A, O, are common in English. Voynich's frequency distribution doesn't match Latin or any European language directly. There are also almost no obvious instances of standard simple words that you'd expect in European language. No single character words like a or I. No clearly repeated common short words like Latin's et or English the, unless they're disguised. Another odd feature, word structure in Voynich is peculiar. Many words appear to be composed of a prefix, a core, and a suffix in patterns that repeat. Certain letters only appear at the start of the words, others only at the end, which is reminiscent of languages that have a strong prefix-suffix system, or could be a clue to an algorithmic cipher. There are also curse-like features. Sometimes the same word repeats 2 or 3 times in a row in known writings. That's rare, except in some poetic or liturgical contexts, holy, holy, holy type repetition. It could be a clue to either a particular linguistic phenomenon or a result of an encoding method. If it is a cipher, it might not be a simple one. By the 1400s, people knew a variety of cipher techniques: simple substitution, polyalphabetic, though those were invented a bit later by mid-1400s, homophonics, using multiple symbols for common letters to hide frequency, etc. The Voynich text doesn't neatly fit any of the typical ones. For instance, a polyalphabetic cipher tends to flatten out symbol frequency, making each letter appear equally often. But Voynich has a clear frequency pattern, some symbols very common, some rare, which looks more like a real language. If it is not a normal cipher, perhaps it's a constructed script for a language, like maybe someone created a unique alphabet for Latin or another language. If so, you'd expect maybe similar word patterns to that language's vocabulary, but identifying which language is tricky, especially with no bilingual text to compare. Perhaps it's not a language at all, but gibberish with the trappings of language. Some have suggested it could be a hoax text generated by a method, for instance by using something like a cardon grill or tables of syllables to produce random but structured text. We'll explore that soon in theories. All these complexities meant that by the mid-20th century, the Voynich Manuscript had earned a reputation as the Mount Everest of cipher puzzles. In fact, in the field of cryptology history, it's often dubbed the most mysterious manuscript in the world. An entire small community of enthusiasts began to form, sharing notes and ideas, initially via letters and small conferences, and later via the internet. It became clear that solving it might require either a brilliant new idea or technology beyond pencil and paper analysis. Enter the era of computers. In the latter half of the 20th century, in early 21st century, computer scientists also got involved. As early as the 1960s, people tried feeding Voynich text, transliterated into ASCII, into early computers to do statistical analysis. ASCII stands for American Standard Code for Information Interchange. It's a way computers represent text using simple, standard letters and symbols, the ones on your keyboard like A through Z, 0 through 9, and punctuations. This helped confirm some of the earlier observations about structure. For example, calculations of entropy, a measure of randomness, showed Voynich text has about 10 bits of entropy per word, similar to English or Latin. whereas if it were random gibberish, it would likely be higher. That supported the notion that it's not just random symbols, it has internal coherence, like a real language or a sophisticated cipher. By the 2000s and 2010s, projects emerged where programmers attempted brute force attacks or AI approaches. There were attempts to see if Voynichnese might be some known language written in code by training algorithms on texts of many languages. One team in 2014, for instance, tried to align the Voynich text with known languages statistically and thought maybe it was an East Asian language encoded. Another effort by researchers in Canada in 2018 applied an AI to guess the underlying language and came up with Hebrew as a candidate and produced a tentative decoding of the first line. Those, as we'll discuss, that attempt was largely discredited by experts because the method used Google Translate and some leaps of logic, but it shows the kinds of experiments being done. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, many claimed solutions appeared in print. Without going into each in detail, suffice to say none gained acceptance. For example, in 1970s, an academic named Mary D'Imperio wrote a state-of-the-art report to the Voynich Manuscript in elegant enigma, summarizing all research up to that point, and still concluding the script was unsolved, though she cataloged many clues. In the 1980s, theories ranged from the manuscript being a medieval Cathar liturgical book proposed by Leo Levatov, who claimed to decipher it as a kind of heretical liturgy, but his translation didn't convince linguists. Gordon Rugg, around 2004, demonstrated one way a 16th century hoaxer could have generated Voynich-like text using a grid of syllables in an overlay, suggesting no real message needed. In the 1990s and 2000s, with the internet connecting Voynich enthusiasts globally, every few years someone would announce, "I've solved it," but usually these were quickly challenged by the community. In the next chapter, we'll cover the more sensational of these claims, including a couple in the late 2010s that made news headlines. But what we've seen so far in this chapter is the persistent effort, brilliant minds, advanced techniques, the best of cryptology and linguistics, all thrown at this manuscript, and all falling just short of conclusively unlocking it. Chapter 5. Leading Theories. What is the Voynich manuscript's text ultimately? Over the years, virtually every conceivable explanation has been put on the table. Let's systematically go through them, grouping them into categories for clarity. We will explore language theories, cipher theories, hoax or non-meaningful theories, and exotic outlier theories. Intertwined with these will be specific hypotheses about authorship or purpose. Remember, none of these has been definitively proven, so we remain in the realm of hypotheses and arguments. Theory 1. An undeciphered cipher of a real language. The earliest and most intuitive idea was that the Voynich manuscript is written in an otherwise normal human language, but encrypted by some cipher. This was essentially what people in the 17th century thought. Barish, Marcy, Kircher all assumed it was a cipher. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sought cryptographic help. If it's a cipher, what kind is it? Simple substitution cipher, Perhaps each character corresponds to a letter or letter group of a known language like Latin, but may be scrambled. If this were true, by analyzing letter frequencies in patterns, one should eventually detect the target language. Many tried this early on and found that no straightforward substitution makes sense. For example, if it were Latin, one might expect the symbol frequencies to roughly mimic Latin's, like lots of vowels, certain consonants common, but Voynich's pattern didn't fit well. Also, simple substitution usually allow you to identify common short words, like et in Latin or de in Romance languages. Nothing obvious popped out. Homophonic cipher. More complex ciphers in medieval times assigned multiple symbols to high-frequency letters to disguise frequency. But Voynich's alphabet isn't large enough to obviously be doing that. If each vowel had 2 to 3 symbols, we'd expect dozens more symbols than we see. Polyalphabetic cipher. Invented in the mid-15th century by Leon Battista Alberti, and later the Vigenère table. These used multiple shifting substitution alphabets to flatten frequency. If someone circa 1500 used a polyalphabetic cipher on Latin plaintext, the Voynich text might result. However, polyalphabetic ciphers typically produce text that looks more random than language, uniform frequency distribution, and more gibberish looking. Voynich text, by contrast, has strong structure. Some characters almost never follow others, some cluster, and more. Unlike what a typical polyalphabetic output will look like. Also, polyalphabetic ciphers were generally unknown in early 1400s. This led to a twist. Maybe it's a verbose cipher. That is, each plaintext character or sound is enciphered as a cluster of Voynich characters. There is some intriguing evidence for this idea. In Voynich text, we often see repeating patterns like or DAIIN, which could correspond to writing out Roman numerals or other multi-letter units. A simple example, to hide a letter X, one might spell it as POR in the cipher. A verbose cipher would inflate the length of the text. Voynich text is indeed quite long for the presumed content. For example, drawings that might only need a caption or a short paragraph have a lot of text. Recently, a 2025 study actually showed it's feasible to design a verbose cipher that maps Latin into gibberish with Voynich-like statistical properties. They named their hypothetical cipher NIBE. That suggests plausibility. A clever 15th century cryptographer could have enciphered a treatise by replacing each letter or syllable of Latin with a combination of symbols, generating the complex structure we see. If that's true, then somewhere underneath all that is a real intelligible text, which could perhaps be recovered if we guess the system. But since we don't know the key or method, it's still beyond reach. Another cipher possibility is a code or nomenclator, common in Renaissance espionage, where whole words or syllables are replaced by symbols. Some Voynich words do repeat in ways reminiscent of a code book, where a symbol stands for a common word, like the or emperor. But usually code books yield some recognizable pattern or repeated phrases. Voynich doesn't give us a crib like a known proper noun to test. One more is steganography, the idea that the text is mostly meaningless, but hiding a message in a subtle way, like every second letter of each word or shapes of glyphs encoding something. For example, maybe the real text is encoded in the number of characters per line, or the positions of certain abnormal characters. This is very hard to prove or disprove. A famous suggestion was that maybe a cardan grill, a mask with holes, could be placed on pages to reveal a hidden message. But the text layout doesn't strongly support that. It isn't in a perfect grid, and line lengths vary. Another idea may be tiny details in the illustrations, like how many petals a flower has, or how many stars in a diagram, provides encoding information. It's all speculative. No one has extracted a coherent hidden message this way yet. If it is a cipher for a real language, which language? Candidates have included Latin, since it was the scholarly lingua franca, or one of the European vernaculars, maybe some form of medieval Italian, Spanish, or Czech, given the Rudolf court context. Also considered were Hebrew. Some suggested maybe a Jewish doctor wrote it in cipher, explaining why it might show ritual baths and so on. Or Arabic, as some alchemical works were in Arabic. But then one wonders why encipher Arabic when few in Europe could read it anyways. Interestingly, in 2018, the computer algorithm guessed Hebrew, albeit with a flawed method. Hebrew as a plain text is possible. Someone noted a Voynich word pattern like OR space OR could correspond to Hebrew VHV, meaning and the. But that's just cherry picking. Without a key, any language guess remains unverified. Evidence for the cipher theory. The biggest supporting point is that throughout history, many manuscripts were encrypted to protect valuable knowledge, especially in alchemy, heretical ideas, or political secrets. A cipher fits the context if someone wanted to keep the content secret, except to those who know the key. Also, the fact that no one could read it historically, Barish, Mercy, etc., implies it's not a known script, thus likely a deliberate cipher or invented script. Evidence against simple cipher. All attempts by skilled cryptologists have failed to identify a clear cipher solution, which is unusual if it were just a typical substitution or transposition of a known language. Additionally, some statistical properties, like two languages A and B, internal word structure rules, suggests more than a straightforward cipher. At this point, many researchers started to entertain that maybe it isn't hiding a normal language via cipher, but rather it is itself a language, albeit an invented or exotic one. This leads us to Theory 2, an invented language or constructed script. The constructed language hypothesis got a boost from William and Elizabeth Friedman's intuition. Perhaps the Voynich Manuscript is written in a real language but using an invented alphabet, or it's written in a language that is itself artificially created by the author, like a secret language or philosophic language. Another variant is a natural language with invented script. For instance, what if the text is plain Latin, or another common language, but written in a cipher alphabet? Many ancient scripts like Greek, Hebrew, have known patterns, but maybe the author just made a unique alphabet to write, say shorthand Latin or a dialect. There have been attempts to map Voynich letters to Latin or Italian or German alphabets, but none yield readability. If someone made a one-to-one replacement of Latin letters with fanciful symbols, the ciphering should be trivial via frequency analysis, which hasn't panned out. So likely it's more complex than a one-to-one swap. Another variant of this theory is a priori constructed language. In the 17th century, philosophers like John Wilkins and Athanasius Kircher tried to create universal languages where symbols represent ideas or categories, not just sound. Could our manuscript be some early attempt at a philosophic language? If so, each word might be composed of parts that denote category, subcategories, or more, rather than spelling out a word phonetically. This might explain the prefix root suffix structure of Voynich words. However, known projects of this type peaked later than the carbon date of Voynich, glossolalia or channeling. Another concept is that the text might not follow any conventional language rules because it was produced in a trance or through speaking in tongue. Throughout history, there have been instances of people writing large texts of what they believed was an unknown language from spiritual visions. For example, in the late 1500s, Edward Kelly, the very man in Prague with John Dee, claimed to receive messages from angels in an unknown Enochian language, which Dee transcribed. Enochian has a grammar and vocabulary, but is believed by most to be a fabrication or subconscious glossolalia by Kelly. Some have whimsically wondered, did someone similar create the Voynich text as a spiritual or magical tongue? If so, it might be internally consistent, hence obeying statistical pattern of language, but not enciphering any existing language. It would essentially be an invented language with invented script, only known to its creator. This theory is hard to verify unless we find evidence of the author or a translation key. The idea that multiple scribes wrote it, as evidenced by handwriting differences, does hint at the possibility it wasn't one person's private madness. The Voynich text does show some patterns akin to natural languages, as we noted entropy levels, clustering of related words in thematic sections. If it were a hoax with random gibberish, it's unlikely to coincidentally have so many language-like traits. This suggests it could be a meaningful language of some kind, just one we haven't identified. Perhaps it's a real language that is rare or extinct, encoded in a special script. Could it be, say, a medieval dialect of an Asian or New World language transcribed in a made-up alphabet? Some have suggested maybe an unwritten language from Central Asia or the Americas, written down by a European in code. The presence of odd plants, and possibly a drawing resembling a sunflower, a New World plant, led Jules Janik and Arthur Tucker to propose that it's not European at all, but an Aztec or Nahuatl herbal, maybe a compendium of Mexican indigenous knowledge, written by Spanish-era natives or missionaries in a cipher. They identified some plants and animals as resembling those from the Americas. They even thought one diagram was a map of Mexico. However, the radiocarbon dating to 1400s contradicts a 1500s origin in New Spain, unless one assumes the vellum was old stock or the dating was off. Others have pointed out some Voynich plant drawings look like they could be stylized versions of East or South Asian plants, raising the question, could it be a treatise from Asia that made its way to Europe? If an early Jesuit or traveler had brought a manuscript from China or India and it got rebound in Europe, but then the script is unlike any Asian script and more like European script flow. Additionally, the presence of European zodiac symbols in medieval-style jars strongly anchors it in the European tradition. So, within invented language theories, a major modern claim was by Dr. Gerard Cheshire in 2019. He announced that he had decoded Voynich as a form of what he called Proto-Romance language, essentially a Latin dialect written in highly abbreviated script. According to Cheshire, the manuscript was a compendium created by Dominican nuns for a Queen of Aragon, Maria of Castile, and contained information on herbal remedies, bathing, hence the nudes and baths, and astrological advice for women's health. He asserted that the language was a lost common language, bridging medieval Spanish, Italians, and more, and that he could translate many passages. This caused a huge stir because it was reported by news media as Voynich Manuscript solved. It's a woman's health manual in Proto-Romance. However, virtually all linguists and medievalists who examined his work were unconvinced. Lisa Fagan Davis, a respected medieval manuscript expert, famously tweeted in response, "Sorry folks, Proto-Romance language is not a thing," noting that Cheshire's supposed translations cherry-picked bits from various Romance languages without consistent grammar, basically forming a mishmash that no real language expert found credible. His paper's peer review was also questioned, and the university he was affiliated with distanced themselves from the claim after the backlash. Cheshire's theory has since been widely regarded as incorrect, but it's an illustrative example. He attempted an invented language solution, not a cipher, but reading the text directly as a language, and it fell short because it didn't hold up to scrutiny. However, Cheshire wasn't the first to claim a direct reading. In 2014, Stephen Bax, a linguistics professor, made a more modest claim. He identified a handful of Voynich words by using illustrations as clues. For instance, beside an illustration of a plant that looked like a known species, say coriander or juniper, if a label was written, he hypothesized that label could phonetically encode the plant's name in some language. He announced tentative identifications of about 10 words and suggested perhaps the text is a treatise on nature in a natural language. Bax's work was cautious, but ultimately not widely substantiated or continued. Sadly, Bax passed away in 2017, and his ideas remained preliminary. Still, his approach was to treat Voynich words as possibly readable if we guessed the language and sound values rather than as pure cipher. For instance, he thought one sequence Kallopan might read Calipan, relating to a Greek plant name. There's a lot of guesswork here, but it shows some think an underlying language could be hiding in plain sight if only we map the alphabet correctly. It might be that the Voynich manuscript is written in an otherwise unknown language, either a constructed one or a rare one, using a unique script, not primarily to be secret, but perhaps as an intellectual exercise or to reach a specific audience. If true, translation requires recognizing that language and script, essentially solving it like deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs or linear B, where you figure out the signs in underlying tongue. But unlike those scripts, we don't have a Rosetta Stone or a second text of known content to compare. That's why progress has been slow. Next, we turn to a more cynical but plausible notion. Theory 3. A grand hoax. What if the reason no one can decipher the Voynich Manuscript is that there is nothing to decipher? In other words, could the entire manuscript be an elaborate hoax or prank, perhaps created to fool someone or to solve for profit, containing cleverly structured nonsense that looks real but isn't? This idea has been around for a long time, and it comes in a few flavors. Medieval Renaissance hoax for profit. Perhaps an alchemist or con artist in the 15th or 16th century made this book to swindle a wealthy patron, like Emperor Rudolf II. We know Rudolf was willing to pay big sums for curiosities. If someone presented a book full of mysterious wisdom and said it was by legendary Bacon or by ancient sages, Rudolf might pay for it. After all, he did collect exotic things. John Dee and Edward Kelly have often been floated as possible perpetrator of such a hoax. Kelly was known for tall tales and did trick Dee and others with supposed alchemical lore. It's not documented that they sold such a book to Rudolf, but if they did, they might have cooked it up artificially. The subtlety of witches example from the British Library is instructive here. It was a cipher manuscript that, when decoded, was just random Latin words, likely created to impress or dupe someone with hidden secrets that turned out to be gibberish when actually translated. If a similar trick was played on Kusher or others, it wouldn't be unprecedented. Hoax by Wilfrid Voynich. A more scandalous version suggests Voynich himself might have forged it in 1912 to increase its mystique and value. Voynich was a clever man with knowledge of manuscripts. Could he have concocted an entire fake manuscript? This is largely dismissed now because of the radiocarbon dating, placing the vellum in the 1400s, and other forensic details that align with genuine age, like the ink. It would be extremely hard for Voynich to source a stack of blank medieval vellum and concoct such a large text without detection. Moreover, the discovery of Barish's 1639 letter in 1999 independently confirmed the manuscript's existence long before Voynich, so the modern forgery idea is not credible now. Meaningless text generated by a cipher device. British researcher Gordon Rugg in 2004 demonstrated that one could generate Voynich-like gibberish using a grid of syllables in a cardan grill, a piece of cardboard with holes. The idea is have a table of possible syllables or strokes. Place a template with holes randomly. Copy the visible syllables in sequence to form a word. Move the template, and so on. This produces words that recur with certain patterns and yields a pseudo-language. Rugg showed that many statistical features of Voynich text could be mimicked this way, implying a 15th century hoaxer could have used such a technique to quickly produce lots of text that looks kind of like language, but isn't meaningful. He even posited that a known 16th century fraud like Johannes Trithemius might be behind it. Trithemius wrote on steganography in ciphers, though no evidence links him directly to Voynich. Rugg's theory doesn't prove that was how Voynich text was made, but it shows it's possible to fabricate a convincing fake with medieval technology. Despite patterns, Voynich text has some bizarre qualities no real language has, like too high repetition of certain words, or the way some sections have unique vocabulary not in others. Also, the illustrations, while detailed, are somewhat fanciful. For example, none of the plants is identifiable. Perhaps a hoaxer deliberately drew partly imagined plants to avoid someone saying, "Hey, that's just common sage. Why is its description unreadable?" By making everything just slightly off from reality, a hoaxer could avoid being caught. If the manuscript was intended to be mysterious and unsolvable, it has certainly succeeded at that for centuries. Many scholars resist the hoax theory because it would have required an immense amount of work to create a 240-page book of gibberish that still maintains internal consistency. A hoaxer would have to be extremely disciplined to keep the fake language coherent throughout. Remember, 5 different scribes possibly wrote it, all following the same rules of the fake language. If it was a collaboration, they all had to know the rules of this invented gibberish. Why go to such lengths? If to fool Emperor Rudolf, sure, but did he ever find out it was nonsense? Perhaps not, if he never deciphered it. The manuscript shows no obvious corrections or mistakes. If it's nonsense, usually a lengthy nonsense text might inadvertently repeat or slip up, but Voynich text is uniformed. It's arguably easier to believe it's a real language or cipher, which naturally would be consistent, than that it's a pure fabrication done perfectly. Additionally, it has too many meaningful seeming structures, like the herbal versus astrological vocabulary differences, which a hoaxer might not think to do. Why would a hoaxer bother to ensure words in plant section differ from those in star sections? Those are either signs of genuine content or an incredibly astute faker. Some propose a middle ground. Maybe it's not entirely nonsense. Maybe a hoaxer embedded some meaningful bits in a sea of filler text. For instance, maybe the real content is encoded somewhere subtly, and the bulk of the writing is just to throw off readers. This loops back to steganography theory, or maybe a hoaxer used an algorithm to generate text, but also had a key for reading every 9th character or something, which is so far undiscovered. Modern handwriting analysis, like that by Lisa Fagan Davis and others, found evidence up to 5 scribes contributing, which could mean if it was a hoax, it might have been a coordinated effort. That's not impossible. Groups like the Rosicrucians, 17th century mystical society, for instance, put out fake manifestos to play intellectual pranks. Some authors have suggested maybe the Voynich Manuscript was a product of such a secret society exercise in coded communication. Raphael Mashkovsky's speculated involvement, the cryptographer friend of Marcy, hence he could have been showing off an unbreakable cipher by actually fabricating an entire coded book. That theory has a certain dramatic flair. Cryptographer makes unbreakable cipher manuscript as a challenge. Indeed, Mishovsky reportedly said he had a cipher no one could break. Maybe Voynich is that demonstration, with poor Barish being fooled into thinking it was meaningful. However, these remain conjectures without direct proof. The hoax theory ultimately suggests the content doesn't matter because there is none, which can feel unsatisfying given how much attention it has drawn. Many in the Voynich research community maintain that the complexity of the manuscript implies a purpose and meaning. Theory 4. The manuscript as a compendium of knowledge. Not so much a decipherment theory as a content theory. Another angle is to assume it's real and ask, what kind of book is it? The prevailing thought, given the sections, is that it's a compendium or reference work. For example, a pharmaceutical or medical manuscript, possibly a physician's reference on herbs, treatments, astrology for diagnosis. The presence of herbs in bathing women suggests medieval medicine. Women bathing could indicate treatments for ailments, astrological charts for timing treatments, recipes for remedy. If so, maybe it was written by or for a particular doctor or noble household. A magical or alchemical manual. The fantastical elements might indicate it's not strictly practical medicine, but more occult. Maybe it contains alchemical recipes disguised in allegory. The astrological and herbal interplay is very alchemical. The nudity and strange diagrams could be symbolic of alchemical processes or cosmology. A guide for women's health and fertility. This is a subset of the medical idea that has gained attention because of the emphasis on female figures. Some have speculated it might be a manual by midwives or nuns for women's medicine, baths for childbirth or healing, herbs for women's issues. If so, why encode it? Possibly to guard that knowledge or because it bordered on taboo. Some medieval female-centered healing was viewed with suspicion by male-dominated officials. Science fantasy or fiction of its day. Could it be someone's imaginative creation not meant to be decoded, but as an artistic expression? A mythopedia, to use Tolkien's term, basically an invented world with its own language or script, like an elaborate role-playing or storytelling prop from the 1400s. While that sounds anachronistic, we shouldn't underestimate human creativity. There is the later example of the Codex Seraphinianus, a modern 1981 art book deliberately reminiscent of Voynich, filled with bizarre illustrations in a fake language meant to evoke the feeling of reading something in an unknown tongue. It was done as an art project, not to be solved, just to create a sense of wonder. Voynich Manuscript could have been a similar endeavor by an earlier mind, but creating such a thing in the 1400s would be unusual without any known parallels. Let's talk about the authorship hypotheses as they tie in to this section. Chapter 6. Who could have written it? Authorship theories. Over time, numerous historical figures have been put forward as the potential author or hoaxer of the Voynich manuscript. Let's review the major candidates and the reasoning behind each. Roger Bacon, 1214 to 1292. This was Wilfrid Voynich's favored candidate. Bacon was an English Franciscan monk, a polymath who wrote about alchemy, optics, and languages. In legend, He was credited with arcane knowledge and inventions. If one were trying to make a mysterious book seem valuable, claiming it's by Roger Bacon would be a shrewd marketing move. However, since carbon dating indicates the vellum was made more than a century after Bacon's death, Bacon cannot be the actual author. So unless somehow the text is copied from an earlier Bacon original and put on newer parchment, which is unlikely, Bacon is out. Today, no serious scholar thinks Bacon wrote it, but historically that theory influenced many early attempts, including Newbold's supposed decipherment finding advanced science that they imagined Bacon could have known. John Dee 1527 to 1608 and or Edward Kelly 1555 to 1597. John Dee was a mathematician, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Kelly was a scryer, a spirit medium, who worked with Dee. They traveled through Central Europe in the 1580s, including Prague, seeking patronage. They were known to perform alchemy and angelic communications. If they had the Voynich Manuscript, it might explain how it got to Rudolf II's court. One version of the theory is that Dee owned a lot of books and may have acquired a mysterious cipher manuscript. He does list an unreadable book in his diaries, though it's unclear if it's Voynich. Or the more conspiratorial is Kelly, who was something of a con man, could have forged it to impress Rudolph. Kelly was convicted of forgery earlier in life for faking alchemical gold, so he had motive and skill in deception. However, for Dee or Kelly to be authors, the manuscript likely would date from their time around 1580s. The vellum being from early 1400s complicates that, unless they found blank older parchment to use. Not impossible, but stretching. Also, John Dee kept diaries of his activities, and there's no mention of creating or selling such a manuscript, although he did note selling some of his library to Emperor Rudolf with no specifics. The Dee or Kelly theory is colorful and ties neatly to the Rudolph story, but timeline issues remain. Giovanni Fontana, 1390 to circa 1455. A lesser-known suggestion, Fontana was a 15th century Venetian engineer and physician who wrote and illustrated books on cryptography, machinery, and even magic. He used simple substitution ciphers in some of his work, with cipher alphabets of his own design, not like Voynich's though. And he drew odd figures like weapon designs, monsters, devices. Some have pointed out superficial similarities between Fontana's drawings and Voynich's. For instance, Fontana drew some bathing figures and weird contraptions as well. Fontana's known ciphers are much simpler, nothing like the Voynich manuscript. But if one were to pick an educated person, circa early 1400s, who could conceive an encoded book, Fontana is a candidate. The timing fits carbon dating. Still, no direct evidence links him to it. It's more of a he was capable of it argument. Fontana never mentioned such a work in his known output. Antonio Avellino Filaretti, circa 1400 to 1469. Proposed by author Nicholas Pilling, Avellino was an Italian architect who wrote an allegorical novel called Il Trattato di Architettura, in which he hid messages. Pilling speculated Avellino might have encoded a secret work, perhaps related to underground knowledge or fictional utopia. This is a fringe idea, with no solid backing beyond circumstantial hints impelling interpretation that some of Averlino's interests and timeline match. Raphael Michalski, circa 1600 to 1644. Remember him? The Czech cartographer friend of Marcy who told the Roger Bacon story. Some think maybe Michalski himself concocted the manuscript to test his unbreakable cipher and then let Barish flounder with it, a sort of prank. Michalski did invent ciphers and brag about them. If he created Voynich, it would have to have been before 1644. On older parchment, which could have been available, this would make it a 17th century creation disguised as older, for instance by using old material. It's somewhat plausible that a cryptologist might have access to older blank codices or reused pages. However, the level of effort to illustrate it comprehensively seems beyond a mere test, but perhaps he wanted to make it convincing. This remains speculation. We lack any known writings of Mishkovsky's stating "I fooled Kircher" or such things. Athanasius Kircher, 1602 to 1680. Here's a twist. Could Kircher himself have made the book either to trick others or as part of his wide-ranging researches? Kircher was into Egyptian hieroglyphs, occult symbolisms, and had the capability to create ciphers. He might have had the means in the Collegio Romano with scribes to fabricate something. But why would he? If he did, why would he pretend to receive it from Marcy? That seems unlikely. Usually it's thought Kircher was a recipient, not an initiator. Also, by the time Kircher got it, the parchment was already old with wormholes, indicating it had been around. Group of creators. Perhaps a small sect, like a heretical sect or secret society, compiled this book. For example, maybe certain alchemists or mystical monks shared a constructed language and made this compendium for their own use, handing it down secretly. There's no direct evidence of such a group, but it's a romantic notion. The multiple scribes idea could fit a small monastic workshop scenario. Female authorship. Given the female figures, some suggest maybe a community of nuns interested in herbal medicine authored it. We do know of a 12th century example, the Book of Ballymote. Not related content-wise, just in terms of being a manuscript with ciphers and obscure content. But more relevant, in the 15th century, there were no known nuns inventing ciphers, but they did write herbal and medical texts. One famous female physician of the Middle Ages was Hildegard of Bingen, circa 12th century, who wrote a coded language called lingua ignota, with an invented alphabet. Hildegard's case shows that in abbeys did create an unknown language with unique letters for spiritual purpose. Voynich Manuscript centuries later could be another such endeavor by women. One wild speculation by researcher Edith Sherwood was that a young Leonardo da Vinci wrote it as a boy. This one doesn't hold up at all with dates or script style, but it shows even Da Vinci's been floated because of the inventive drawings. As we see, pinpointing an author is like picking your favorite character from a historical drama. Each theory reflects a narrative someone finds plausible. The clever English occultist, the cunning Czech cryptographer, the Renaissance engineer. None have proof. After reviewing all these theories and candidates, we must confront why none has been confirmed. Usually, decipherments in historical mysteries get solved when a new piece of evidence comes to light, or when someone applies a methodology that clicks. but no second copy of Voynich text or partial translation has ever been found in archives to compare. The manuscript's text is long enough that random chance of false solution is slim. Any real solution should be able to decode pages consistently into sensible text. So far, every claimed solution falls apart beyond a few decoded sentences, which themselves often sound like gibberish or overly interpretive. If it's a cipher, perhaps the key was lost centuries ago, and it's too sophisticated to brute force without it. If it's a dead language or a unique language, we might need more context or bilingual inscriptions, which we don't have. The sheer amount of effort needed to rigorously test every theory is daunting. Many proposals never go beyond initial claim because the proposers cannot translate the whole thing. They might cherry pick some sections and declare victory prematurely. It's enlightening to think how scholars deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs by recognizing proper names in cartouches and having the Greek translation on the Rosetta Stone, or how Linear B was cracked, noticing patterns corresponding to known Greek words for numbers in items. For Voynich, we haven't found a clear anchor, like a name or phrase we can be confident about. Some thought the astrological section with zodiac signs might have names of months or zodiac written around it. If those small labels are indeed month names, that's a clue, but not necessarily in the Voynich script itself. Thus, we remain at an impasse where multiple avenues are open but none confirmed. Chapter 7. Ongoing research in the Voynich community. As of today, the Voynich manuscript is still unsolved, but research continues. The advent of better imaging technology has helped a bit. Multispectral scans have revealed faint text or marks. They also found guides for the drawings and possibly erased mistakes or corrections, which tell us scribes did plan their writing carefully. There was a recent project that scanned the entire manuscript in high resolution and made it available online. So now anyone around the world can pore over it. This democratization has been double-edged. It brings fresh eyes, computer scientists, linguists not previously involved, and enthusiastic amateurs, which is great, but also fueled periodic sensational claims of it's solved, often by folks not deeply familiar with prior research. One very recent scholarly paper, the one from 2023, used AI-based script comparison not to decode the text, but to see what known writing systems the Voynich script resembles. They reportedly found it closest to scripts of South Asia, specifically a script called Koji from India. This doesn't mean the Voynich text is written in an Indian language, but they were comparing shapes and patterns. It suggests maybe the character shapes have a similar distribution of pen strokes as some Brahmic family scripts, which is intriguing, but not conclusive of anything. It's a new approach, though, using machine learning to classify the script style. Another area of research is statistical analyses by various teams, which have looked at higher order patterns like word adjacency, the possibility of two languages which might correspond to different scribes or different content, and even the possibilities of more dialects. Understanding these could hint if it's two different source texts combined, or evolution of a language over time. From time to time, conferences or dedicated seminars are held. There was one on the Voynich manuscript's 100th anniversary of Voynich finding it in 2012. They gather cryptographers, medievalists, linguists, and other interdisciplinary folks. The consensus at these tends to be sober. Many ideas, nothing proven yet, need more clues. Will the Voynich Manuscript ever be solved, or is it destined to remain an eternal mystery? Both outcomes are conceivable. If it is meaningful, one day, perhaps a breakthrough in pattern recognition or a lucky archival discovery could unravel it. If it's meaningless, we might just finally conclude that after testing all plausible solutions and finding no coherence, as of now, scholars like Renee Zandbergen, one of the longest-running Voynich researchers, often say, whenever you hear it's been solved, be skeptical because many have cried wolf. He maintains on his website essentially a notice that all such claims have fallen flat and that, as of yet, the Voynich Manuscript has not been decoded. Chapter 8. Cultural Impact in the Lure of the Unsolved. The Voynich Manuscript, beyond its academic intrigue, has seeped into popular culture and the public imagination. It appears in novels, video games, and TV shows as a symbol of the ultimate enigma. People are drawn to it not just to solve it, but to marvel at it. In a sense, it stands as a work of art as much as a puzzle. If you flip through its pages, well, the scans, even not understanding a whit of the text, you get a mysterious, otherworldly vibe, a combination of whimsy, the odd drawings, and earnestness, the careful scripts. It's almost like a fantasy book or a prop from an Indiana Jones movie, but it's real and it's old. This has a meditative effect on some enthusiasts. A few have even learned to write the Voynich script or created fonts of it or painted replicas of its pages. In a way, engaging with it can be an artistic or relaxing pursuit, divorcing it from needing a solution. It's like enjoying a piece of ambient music with lyrics in a language you don't understand. Sometimes the not understanding is part of the allure. Many people say the reason the Voynich Manuscript fascinates us is that it represents the unknown in an age where we think we know so much. It's a reminder that there are still riddles out there not unraveled by technology or scholarship. It has humbled codebreakers and teased linguists. Each person who studies it ends up possibly learning a lot, even if they don't crack it, which is a reward in itself. Authors like Umberto Eco, who is passionate about signs and symbols, found it compelling. He visited Yale just to see it. It inspired novel plots. There's the novel The Voynich Cipher and others. Even skeptics forums and podcasts like Skeptoids have episodes explaining why the latest solve isn't real, showing it's widely discussed. In the restful silence of today's episode, one can imagine the Voynich Manuscript as a sleeping dragon, ancient, covered in ornate scales of script, gently breathing mystery. Scholars come like knights or explorers, trying different methods to wake or tame the dragon, but it just slumbers on, guarding its secrets. Perhaps one day, one of them speaks the right incantation, and the dragon opens its eyes, revealing whether it was a friendly creature or just a mirage. Until that day, we circle around it, describing its appearance and guessing at its nature. Conclusion. We have journeyed through every aspect of the Voynich Manuscript saga. its contents and appearance, its known history from a bohemian alchemist's library to a vault in Yale, the fervent attempts to decode its script, and the rainbow of theories about what it could be. We have looked at it as a cipher, a language, a hoax, a treasure of wisdom, and even a folly. In doing so, we've also touched upon medieval science, Renaissance courts, cryptographic principles, and the psychology of mysteries. The meditative aspect of this unsolved mystery invites a philosophical reflection. Sometimes the pursuit of knowledge yields answers, and sometimes it yields deeper appreciation of the unknown. In trying to solve the Voynich Manuscript, generations of researchers have inadvertently built a small field of Voynichology that collected medieval plant lore, cipher techniques, and historical connections. The journey has perhaps been as valuable as the destination, which still recedes beyond the horizon. As you listen to this in a perhaps sleepy state, you might wonder, would it spoil the magic if tomorrow a press release announced Voynich Manuscript decoded? It's just a mundane medical recipe book after all. Part of us would rejoice at the solution. Another part might feel a tinge of loss that the grand enigma is gone. Many solved mystery become less captivating once you know the answer, but unsolved ones, they tantalize indefinitely. For now, the Voynich Manuscript remains an open book in the literal sense, with each page visible, yet unreadable. It continues to invite each new generation to take a crack at it, or simply to marvel at its inscrutable beauty, and in that way, it has outlived its original text and become something almost mythic. Imagine one final scene, late night, in Yale's Beinecke Library. The lights are low. Inside a climate-controlled glass case rests the Voynich Manuscript, open to a page of flowing script and a drawing of a curious plant with roots like a human figure. Perhaps a researcher stands there, gazing at it in silence, or perhaps only the cleaning staff passes by, unaware of the riddle within those pages. The manuscript sits quietly, as it has for centuries, keeping its secrets sleepily to itself, waiting for that future moment when someone, at last, speaks its language. Or perhaps it will remain an eternal lullaby of the unknown, whispering to us that not everything in our world has yielded its mystery. And so, we end our narrative here. May your dreams be filled with elegant cipher alphabets and fantastical medieval drawings, a tribute to the enduring enigma of the Voynich Manuscript.